What is the price of silence, and how many deaths are required to bury a secret? In the Charleston County archives, there is a chilling, incomplete court document from March 1848. The final legible sentence ends abruptly. The testimony of 9 deceased cannot be admitted as their deaths occurred under circumstances the court finds. The rest was intentionally excised. Local historians noted something far more disturbing. 9 death certificates were filed within 72 hours, all listing the same plantation, bearing the same physician's signature, and listing the cause of death with a single chilling word: executed simultaneously. The plantation ledgers show the names of 9 men crossed out in red ink on March 14, 1848. The disturbing question is not what crime these men committed, but what dangerous testimony they possessed about the couple who lived in the manor house, Baron Wilhelm Vanderhorn, and his delicate wife, Margarita. If you love dark American history and long-buried stories no one talks about, this episode of the Forgotten Liturgy will leave you thinking long after it ends. The precision exactly 9 men suggested cold calculation, not rage. Ashborne Plantation, 12 miles inland from Charleston, was a sprawling cotton estate inherited in 1845 by Baron Wilhelm Vanderhorn. Wilhelm had purchased his Baron title in Germany, adding a thin veneer of aristocracy to his planter status. He was 37, a man whose hands trembled slightly, a symptom that had worsened since his return from a Berlin sanatorium in 1844 for nervous exhaustion. Wilhelm arrived at Ashborne with his arranged wife, Margarita, 23. Beautiful and delicate, Margarita was sickly, suffering from chronic womanly complaints. She spent her days in her chambers, drowsy and compliant, attended by her personal physician, Dr. Ernst Keller, who remained permanently at Ashborne. The Baron's true obsession, however, was not his wife's health, but their lack of fertility. The plantation operated with about 130 enslaved people. Among them were 9 men ranging from 19 to 34 who worked in house service and groundskeeping. They were specifically chosen, not for their agricultural skill, but for their physical attributes and what one ledger coldly termed breeding quality. These men included Thomas Ridley, 28, Marcus Finch, 23, and Robert Foster, 19, existed in the close, dangerous proximity of power. They were better fed and clothed, but subjected to closer scrutiny and intimate forms of exploitation. Their existence was meticulously tracked in the Baron's private ledgers, with measurements and lineage tracking, records that suggested he was maintaining specific breeding records. Ashbourne's intentional isolation from Charleston meant the planters could maintain elaborate public fictions of honor and paternalism, while engaging in systematic brutality and dark private practices. Producing heirs was paramount, placing white women on a gilded cage of expectation. In the antebellum South, producing a legitimate male heir was not just personal. It was an economic and social imperative tied to property consolidation and family prestige. By the fall of 1847, after 2.5 years of marriage, Margarita had not conceived, and Baron Wilhelm Vanderhorn's desperation grew. He furiously rejected a Philadelphia doctor's suggestion that the problem might lie with him. Then, in December 1847, his actions became highly unusual. Overseer logs show 9 housemen were suddenly reassigned to exclusive manor service. These 9 men were separated from the enslaved community and, one by one, began to disappear into the main house for periods of 2 to 5 days. When they returned, they were silent, marked by bruises and strange injuries that suggested restraint or struggle. The enslaved community speculated medical experiments, unusual punishment, or sexual exploitation, but nothing fit the terrifying precision of the situation. Meanwhile, Margarita Vanderhorn began to reappear in public. Women who saw her in early 1848 remarked on her improved health and even described her as radiant. Yet, they also noted she looked haunted, gripping a neighboring planter's hand with eyes that seemed to plead for something they could understand. By late February, the horrifying truth spread through the quarters. The Baron, driven by the grotesque logic of slavery, had reasoned that if his wife couldn't conceive with him, the solution was to use men. He owned men who could be compelled and then disposed of. He had commanded each of the 9 men, in sequence, to impregnate his wife. The horror lay in the Baron's calculation. He forced enslaved men to commit acts that would be framed as rape, simultaneously violating his wife, knowing that the resulting child would legally be his property regardless of biological paternity. The entire truth could be erased by simply killing everyone who knew it. Dr. Ernst Keller, the German physician, facilitated this atrocity. He monitored Margarita's fertile periods and was present during the encounters for medical supervision, effectively documenting systematic sexual violence orchestrated by the Baron. The 9 men had no choice. When Thomas Ridley initially refused, he was taken to the cellar and shown instruments of mutilation. Given a choice between rape and castration, confronted with the choice between castration and compliance, all 9 men chose survival. Meanwhile, Margarita Vanderhorn was heavily sedated during the forced encounters, conscious enough to comply, but drugged enough to be compliant to state the Baron and Dr. Keller believed absolved them of further moral crime. By March 8, 1848, Dr. Keller confirmed Margarita was pregnant. His private German journal noted, "Conception confirmed. Employer satisfied. Disposal protocols to commence immediately." The Baron had always intended to eliminate the 9 men the moment they became disposable. Liabilities who knew the child's true paternity. On March 12th, the 9 men were summoned to the manor house parlor. The Baron, using the deceptive word gentleman, announced their reward: freedom. Manumission papers would be prepared, and they would be transported to Charleston the next morning with $20 cash. The men knew he was lying. They were witnesses to an unspeakable crime, and the simultaneous freeing of 9 healthy enslaved men was a financial impossibility for the Baron. Knowing the danger, they made a desperate choice that night: to testify. They reasoned that if they could reach a magistrate or lawyer in Charleston and publicly expose the crime the Baron using enslaved men to rape his wife, it would create a scandal that could destroy him and potentially save them. They planned to leave on March 13th, but they never made it to the wagon. At 4 a.m. on March 13th, 7 white men, local planters and peers of the Baronaire, they had been summoned by urgent messages claiming the 9 men were planning a slave rebellion to murder the family and burn the plantation. Armed, the 7 men, whether believing the lie or simply agreeing to participate in the fiction, helped the Baron. The 9 men were dragged from their quarters, bound, and taken to an area behind the house where 3 live oak trees stood. The entire enslaved community was forced to watch. What followed was execution as a public ritual, but the Baron's script broke down. As the ropes were prepared, Thomas Ridley began to shout, not for mercy, but testimony. The other 8 joined him, their voices carrying the truth across the plantation and the dawn air. They named dates, described Dr. Keller's role, and exposed the systematic violation orchestrated by the Baron. In the manor house, windows slammed shut as Margarita heard her violation shouted for the world to know. The Baron frantically accelerated the executions. The only official record of 9 men's deaths is a brief notation in the local sheriff's log. Baron Vanderhorn reports suppression of slave rebellion at Ashborne. 9 conspirators executed. No white casualties. Matter resolved. However, the noise generated by the shouting testimony was impossible to contain. A Charleston lawyer later wrote that the claims made by the deceased are salacious enough to have achieved some circulation. The Vanderhorn affair created a serious public disturbance. The 9 executed men were hastily buried in unmarked graves near the South Marsh boundary of Ashborne. No markers were placed, but their shouted testimony had been heard. The full, terrifying truth of the Baron's actions. The forced rapidly through the Low Country's secret enslaved networks. In Charleston, a free black seamstress named Ruth Denny heard the detailed story from her cousin. Ruth Denny did something extraordinary. She wrote down a detailed account, including the names, dates, and the precise testimony the 9 men had shouted as they died. She brought this account to Edmund Barclay, a 43-year-old Charleston lawyer. Barclay, who owned enslaved people himself, initially refused a dangerous request to bring charges against a white planter on behalf of dead slaves. But Ruth Denny waited for 3 hours and presented him with a written account of events that, if true, constituted murder if the rebellion story was false and a profound moral offense against his own wife. Barclay agreed to investigate, motivated not by abolitionism, but by a belief that the rule of law must mean something. His investigation at Ashborne met immediate resistance. The Baron Wilhelm Vanderhorn curtly stated the executions were legal and dismissed the men as dying claims, as lies of desperate men. He refused to let Barclay question his wife, Margarita, stating she was unwell and would not be subjected to questions about lies told by animals. He also issued a polite but clear threat to Barclay's career. Despite the threat, Barclay made a crucial discovery at the Charleston courthouse. Dr. Ernst Keller's medical license application referenced a Berlin training facility where he studied applied genetics and breeding optimization in mammalian species with theoretical extensions to human improvement, a clear precursor to eugenics. Barclay also found records of Keller purchasing excessive quantities of sedatives. Armed with this, Barclay filed a formal complaint on April 18, 1848. Requesting an inquest into the 9 deaths on the grounds that the execution was carried out to conceal crimes committed against Margarita, Vanderhorn, and the deceased. The scandal immediately split Charleston society. The court, under pressure, scheduled a preliminary hearing for May 2, 1848. However, the night before the hearing, tragedy struck. Someone broke into Barclay's office and destroyed his case files. Only copies stored at home survived. Ruth Denny disappeared and was never seen again. Margarita Vanderhorn went into premature labor at Ashborne Plantation. The hearing on May 2nd lasted less than 4 hours. The Baron appeared with 3 lawyers, and the 7 white participants, who all swore they had responded to a genuine slave rebellion. The atmosphere in the Charleston County courthouse on May 2nd, 1848, was stifling. Nearly 200 people, planters, merchants, and correspondents crowded the small chamber for the preliminary hearing. Judge Samuel Winthrop presided, a man known to follow the law that, in South Carolina, protected property above all else. The Baron's lead attorney, Clayton Merrick, delivered a contemptuous opening statement, focusing entirely on property rights. He argued that allowing the courts to question a planter's actions based on the dying words of criminals would destroy the social order. The fabric of our society depends on order, and order depends on the authority of property holders, he stated. Edmund Berkeley's counter-argument was measured. He argued that the court needed to examine whether the executions were carried out to justify a crime rebellion or to conceal the impregnation scheme. Barclay presented his circumstantial evidence. Copies of apothecary records showing Dr. Keller purchased sedatives in excessive quantities. A deposition detailing the sale of 9 sets of small, specialized iron restraints like those used in medical facilities to the Baron in January 1848. Testimony from Moses Green, a free black carpenter, who installed heavy exterior locks on a ground-floor room at Ashborne in December 1847. 7 white witnesses who participated in the executions were called. All confirmed the Baroness' claim of a rebellion plot and dismissed the 9 men as shouts about Mrs. Vanderhorn as dispiritlise. During cross-examination, Barclay pressed James Hartwell, a neighboring planter, on the shouted claims the forced breeding scheme. Hartwell admitted, "I had no reason not to believe the Baron." Crucially, he admitted that in his experience, such a scheme, using enslaved men to impregnate a white wife, was unheard of, because it would be socially catastrophic and violate the principle of white female purity. Barclay then called Catherine Mills, Dr. Keller's elderly, respectable white housekeeper. She testified that Keller kept extensive medical journals with human figures with measurements and breeding charts, like UDC, and agricultural texts about livestock. She also recalled Keller, while drinking, claiming he was part of an important experiment at Ashborne that would prove his theories about controlled heredity. Barclay noted that the court was forced to reconstruct the truth from fragments, because South Carolina law created a convened shield for those who committed crimes against people who had no legal voice. At 11:30 a.m., an unexpected event occurred. Dr. Ernst Keller, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. He was small, worn-looking, but his voice was strong. "I have information relevant to these proceedings," Keller stated, overriding the Baron's lawyers. "I have medical records that document treatments, conditions, and actions taken at Ashborne Plantation from 1845 to the present. I request permission to testify." Judge Winthrop, recognizing the gravity, confirmed that Keller understood the risks of testifying against his employer, including professional consequences for violating confidentiality. The courtroom fell into an absolute silence as Dr. Ernst Keller approached the stand, declaring that the 9 deaths lay heavily on his conscience. He began his testimony by establishing his expertise in hereditary science and confirming he was hired to treat Margarita's reproductive issues. Keller quickly revealed that Baron Wilhelm Vanderhorn was obsessed with heredity, fearing he carried weaknesses from his own family line and asking Keller if it was theoretically possible to use other men's seed through medical intervention. Keller admitted that, for nearly a year, starting in 18, he administered chemicals and herbal preparations to Margarita, telling her they were treatments for inflammation. But in reality, they rendered her temporarily infertile. He confessed, "I did this, God forgive me, for nearly a year." The Baron, sitting motionless, stared at Keller with a murderous expression. In December 1847, the Baron revealed his full plan. He had selected 9 enslaved men with superior characteristics to be used in sequence, while Margarita was sedated. The resulting child would be legally his, and the men would be eliminated afterward to ensure secrecy. The courtroom erupted in chaos. When order was restored, Keller continued, describing the winter of 1847 to 48 in chilling detail. The ground floor room, the increasing doses of laudanum and chloral hydrate keeping Margarita semi-conscious, and the Baron supervising the multiple rapes. Keller's voice finally broke as he confessed, "I was facilitating rape. I knew, and I said nothing." Asked why he was speaking now, Keller claimed it was because the men died telling the truth, forcing him to acknowledge the evil he could no longer pretend was science. He then dropped a second bombshell. "The Baron plans to do it again." Keller revealed that Margarita had lost the child that was stillborn, and the Baron, blaming the stress of the hearing, planned to repeat the procedure with new men. Viewing the first attempt as merely a learning experience, Keller stated firmly, I cannot participate in that again." The Baron stood, pushing his lawyers aside, demanding Keller be arrested for perjury. Keller admitted his primary medical journals were stolen the previous night, but produced a single folded page from his pocket February 1848 entry documenting Margarita's condition and the pregnancy confirmation. Judge Winthrop, visibly shaken after reviewing the page, delivered a careful compromise ruling that defined the tragic outcome. He found no grounds to charge the Baron with crimes related to the 9 men's deaths, maintaining that the executions were lawful under the pretense of suppressing a threat. However, regarding the allegations of crimes against Mrs. Vanderhorn and the plan to repeat the actions, he ordered a separate inquest to be held in closed session on May 16th to investigate the treatment of a white woman. The transcript ends with the chilling note, "The testimony of 9 deceased cannot be admitted as their deaths occurred under circumstances the court finds," after which the rest is deliberately removed with a blade. That very night, May 2nd, 1848, everything that might have led to justice was systematically destroyed. Dr. Ernst Keller died in his boarding house of alleged heart failure at the age of 39. His journals and the single page of evidence missing. Simultaneously, Edmund Berkeley's home was burglarized, and his remaining documents were stolen. The night of May 2nd, 1848, became a coordinated act of erasure. While Dr. Ernest Keller died mysteriously of supposed heart failure, Edmund Berkeley was brutally attacked in his study. He was struck with a heavy object, suffering a fractured temporal bone and severe bleeding in his brain. When found, his office was ransacked. Every single document related to the Ashborne case was gone. Berkeley never fully recovered, suffering memory problems and headaches until his death in 1850, unable to reconstruct the case from memory alone. Simultaneously, at Ashborne Plantation, Margarita Vanderhorn went into premature labor at 6 months. The child, a boy, was born alive, but died within hours. The midwife, Ellen Byers, later recounted that Margarita seemed not devastated, but emotionally shattered, refusing to look at the infant with an expression that Byers interpreted as horror or relief at what the child represented. The closed inquest scheduled for May 16th was quietly cancelled by Judge Winthrop. With Keller dead and Berkeley incapacitated, there was no one left to present evidence. Winthrop noted privately that pursuing the matter served no purpose but to create scandal. Court transcript itself was later filed and partially destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1850, for though the surviving copies all had the final, crucial page removed. The infant was buried in the family cemetery under a white marble stone, inscribed only as beloved child, May 3rd, 1848, without a name. Margarita, meanwhile, became a ghost in her own house. The midwife, Byers, observed her sitting by the window after the burial, just empty, like someone had reached inside and removed whatever makes a person alive. Though officially silenced, the story spread like wildfire through the enslaved community. The 9 men's dying testimony had been heard by roughly 70 people, enslaved workers, overseers, and the 7 white planters. The story of the Baron who used and murdered enslaved men to impregnate his wife, and who was protected by a system that valued property rights over human life, circulated across the Low Country. The disappearance of Ruth Denny was understood as the cost of seeking justice. Reverend Peter Thompson, a minister in Charleston's free black community, recorded the 9 names in his journal: Marcus, Isaiah, Daniel, Jacob, Samuel, Levi, Nathaniel, Robert Prain. They would be remembered. Margarita Vanderhorn remained at Ashborne for 3 more years, fading slowly. Visitors noted she was profoundly altered, speaking in a flat manner, moving painfully, and looking much older than her 27 years. She contracted what was diagnosed as consumption, but modern historians suspect severe post-traumatic stress disorder combined with chronic opiate use. She died on November 14, 1851, at age 29, and was buried next to the unnamed infant. The elaborate headstone the Baron commissioned, inscribed "Beloved Wife," stood as a monument to his hypocrisy. After her death, the Baron's social collapse accelerated. Isolated and avoided by his peers, he remarried in 1853 to an Elizabeth Hartwell, a Bentidozia, from a financially struggling Virginia planter family, desperate to restart his life. The Baron's new marriage to an Elizabeth Hartwell was one in legal name only, and maintained a separate residence in Charleston, and the couple had no children, leaving the question of the Baron's potential infertility unanswered. Wilhelm lived increasingly alone at Ashborne, haunted by the estate's memories. By 1860, he had sold away almost all the enslaved people who were present during the events of 1847–48, ensuring that almost none of the original witnesses remained. When Sherman's forces occupied South Carolina in 1865, the Baron was 53. His health shattered by headaches and melancholia. On April 23, 1865, shortly after the war's end, Baron Vanderhorn was found dead in his study. The Union medical examiner ruled it suicide, a pistol shot to the head, though the ambiguous circumstances led some to suspect murder. The newly freed people at Ashborne offered no information, and Elizabeth inherited Ashborne but never returned to South Carolina, selling the property in 1866. The plan to cultivate cotton with free labor failed almost immediately. The newly freed people refused to work the land, calling it cursed and haunted by the 9 men who died there. White workers also would not stay, driven away by the isolation and atmosphere. The main house stood empty for 3 years. On the night of March 13, 1871, exactly 23 years after the 9 men's execution, the house burned to the ground. The cause was never determined, with no storms or a clear explanation. All that remained were ash and chimney stacks. The fire was seen by many as divine justice. By 1900, almost no physical trace of the plantation remained. The Vanderhorn family cemetery, where Margarita and the infant lay, was consumed by vegetation. The white marble stones toppled and forgotten. The 9 men's graves were never located. Despite multiple searches by historians and archaeologists across the decades, the South Marsh boundary where they were supposedly buried had shifted and changed too much. They remain lost, their bodies denied dignity. However, their testimony wasn't erased. The stories circulated for generations through black communities, becoming a core part of the oral tradition, teaching stories about the true, unsanitized nature of slavery. The essential truth remained. 9 men were executed for knowledge, not for rebellion. In 1889, a book was published in Boston, Legal Anomalies and Suppressions in Antebellum South Carolina Courts, which included a brief but accurate anonymous account of the 1848 case. The author noted that the records were deliberately destroyed because the truth, slavery's core pretenses of paternalism and moral boundaries were absolute lies, was too dangerous to acknowledge. The 9 men: Thomas Ridley, Marcus Finch, Isaiah Brennan, Daniel Puit, Jacob Orth, Samuel Hoyt, Levi Church, Nathaniel Cross, and Robert Foster were murdered for the crime of being witnesses. They spent their final moments shouting the truth, ensuring that the horror could not be entirely silenced. Their names appear only in fragments of destroyed ledgers, partial court transcripts, and the living memory of communities who refuse to let them be forgotten. Their story is a testament to the power of resistance, proving that even when the powerful attempt to erase a truth, the voices of the silenced can still persist through time.